Black Labor, White Wealth by Claude, Dr. Claude Anderson. Andale pues. All right. Corporate and other corporate and other special interests. In the 1980s, while poor blacks were denied educational and business opportunities, bank loans, home mortgages, food stamps, welfare payments, and other forms of assistance, the federal government, headed by conservative politicians, administered a system of financial incentives, cash payments, loans, loans with favorable repayment terms, tax breaks, lucrative government contracts, and other giveaways for wealthy individuals and corporations. These policies, combined with business friendly legislation, such as refusals to raise minimum wage, amounted to an affirmative action program for wealthy corporations. Common Cause Common Cause complied data Common Cause complied data on governmental preferential treatment policies for these wealthy producing industries. See Table 9. Table 9, preferential groups receiving federal assistance in the 1980s. Okay, we already went there. Conclusion. Blacks were involved in every aspect of the development of the American nation. We cleared the land and produced the crops. We raised the food and the children of white families. We fought in every war and developed the land expropriated from the American Indians, though we were permitted to be buried only in certain non white areas of this very land. Blacks produce the wealth that whites in both the old and new worlds possessed and claimed to have achieved by the sweat of their brows. Blacks produce the wealth that whites in both the old and new worlds possessed and claimed to have achieved by the sweat of their brows. The centuries of physical and psychological abuse that black people suffered were tragic, but even worse, the dominant white society has systematically hidden the fact that the foundations of the American, European, Latin American, and Caribbean economies are rooted in the labor and production of blacks. Black labor fueled the exponential growth in the economies of numerous nations around the world. For centuries, slave produced products were found in every home in every Christian and non Christian nation. Slave, Slaves produced the raw goods and filled storage facilities, warehouses, and merchant shelves in nearly two-thirds of the world. They provided fibers for textiles and clothes, food, alcohol, and raw materials for the factories. Black slaves and Jim Crow labor, directly or indirectly, generated not only thousands of jobs in vertically integrated industries, but also provided what most people of this nation wore and ate. The increased reliance on computers and immigrant labor has all but ended white society's dependence on black muscle power. Yet, the planned obsolescence of black labor will only exacerbate the 600-year black holocaust. Second class citizenship will only end when blacks can recognize political, economic, and social trends and policies that are detrimental to them as a group, and collectively demand either an end to such practices or inclusion as beneficiaries of such practices. Chapter 7, the National Public Policy on Black People. Take up the white man's burden, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Kipling, 1899. Take up the white man's burden, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. The totality of black people's existence and condition in America stems directly from a national public policy designed by white society to control and use black labor to build a new nation. The public policy on the use of blacks developed incrementally until it became like an onion with many layers. It began taking shape in 1619 and evolved into a systematic, mandated social arrangement that dictated the behavior of both blacks and whites. The policy's core principles stipulated that blacks were to be used as a well disciplined, uncompensated, subordinated, non competitive, permanent labor class that existed on the margins of society. The national public policy determined black people's human worth and status, as well as their educational and political opportunities and their cultural and family values. The national public policy determined black people's human worth and status, as well as their educational and political opportunities and their cultural and family values. The dominant white society's national public policy explicitly and implicitly defined how blacks were to be treated and used. Public policy is important for blacks to study because it gives clear insight into the process and methods that the dominant society used to establish absolute control over millions of blacks as a laboring class. But equally important, it shows blacks who are seeking to gain power through community organizing the way whites constructed a national black policy plan. But equally important, it shows it shows blacks. Equally important, it shows blacks who are seeking to gain power through community organizing the way whites constructed a national black policy and plan. Understanding that plan is essential to the shaping of a new public policy for blacks. The public policy was formulated from racial dogmas and doctrines that justify the policy. The doctrine of racial superiority legitimized the exclusion and segregation of blacks from mainstream white society. The doctrine of non-interference dissuaded governments and social institutions from using their resources and power to stop the abuse of black people. And the doctrine of expendability promoted the belief that black life was non-sacred and that there was nothing wrong with using blacks for the betterment and protection of white life. These policy doctrines and dogmas continue to determine the quality of life for whites and blacks in America today. How the national policy on blacks developed. European culture set the stage for the exploitative use of black Africans and the social and physical conditions of life in the New World drove the English to construct an aggressive strategy to enslave them. No single factor compelled Europeans to seek out blacks to serve as the labor class of the world, of the New World. No single factor compelled Europeans to seek out blacks to serve as a labor class of the New World. Many factors converged simultaneously. The English people, like most Europeans, harbored racist attitudes towards black people long before the first settlers arrived on the North American continent. The European traders and explorers to Africa had brought back stories about the dark continent and its dark-skinned heathens. The 17th century Anglo-Saxon culture was filled with anti-black terms, and the first English settlers brought their prejudices with them to America. The first 20 blacks entered Jamestown in 1619 on a Dutch warship. Whether or not these blacks were slaves is a matter of interpretation because the records from that period are scant. But it is reasonable to assume that they were not considered slaves initially. They had been rescued from a Portuguese slave trading vessel by the Dutch warship. They were brought to Jamestown and the Dutch captain exchanged them for food and ship supplies. If the Dutch captain indebted the blacks in the exchange, it was probably as indentured servants, because records revealed that within 5 years these blacks were free to buy land, carry weapons, go to court, attend church, and generally socialize with other settlers until the late 1630s. The cycle of black degradation in the American colonies was well underway by the late 1630s. Labor was critical. No one was available to do the backbreaking work, not even the free blacks, not even the free blacks. Word of the terrible work conditions had gotten back to Europe, and whites refused to come to America as indentured servants. Colonial courts and legislative assemblies had begun to enact punitive legislation or rulings against blacks and any whites who consorted with them. As discussed earlier, the Maryland colony set the stage for black slavery in America by issuing a government policy that singled blacks out for subordinate and exclusionary treatment based upon available records. Scattered incidences of Indian, white, and black slavery were appearing in the Maryland colony as early as 1634. But 4 years later, in 1638, the first public edict or policy against blacks was issued by the Maryland Colonial Assembly. The edict declared that neither the original 20 free blacks nor their offspring shall be permitted to enjoy the fruits of white society. This Maryland edict became the founding public policy for the use and treatment of blacks for which white racism, Jim Crowism, and segregation later grew. Timeline 1877 to 1905. 1877 to 1905. 1877, President Hayes removed federal troops from South. 1877, Northerners reunited with Southerners. Northerners reunited with Southerners. Federal government adopts policy of non-interference in the South. Non-interference, non-interference, non-interference. The doctrine of non-interference dissuaded governments and social institutions from using their resources and power to stop the abuse of black people. All right, all right. 1885. 1885 through 1905, more than 2,800 blacks were lynched. 1885, European nations devise plans for colonizing black Africa. 1885. 1885, 1985. 1885. 1985. 2025. A 1890, Age of Accommodation began. 1896, U.S. Supreme Court issued Plessy versus Ferguson decision. White vigilante activities increased. Immigration of Euro ethnics increased. A broad community needs a broad community need shapes the public policy. An abundance of free land and a shortage of labor made involuntary labor the key to white survival. Those who owned the largest tracts of undeveloped land could not convert the huge tracts into productive, profitable agricultural businesses without the assistance of a disciplined, strong, expendable, and preferably unpaid workforce. Without such a labor force, it was questionable whether the colonies could survive, let alone prosper. Neither Indians nor white indentured servants would do the laborer's work. A bound labor force was the logical solution. The Maryland Public Edict on blacks took on greater importance as the colonial settlers realized that they possibly had the key to their common labor problem in the use of black people as their uncompensated workers. The labor problem was resolved in 1665 when all of the existing colonies enacted laws to enslave blacks. The Maryland colony's original edict was expanded into a public policy on blacks, stipulating that black people shall constitute an available, uncompensated, non competitive, well disciplined, permanently subordinated workforce, which shall be separated from the white society. England supported the colonies' enactment of slavery laws by establishing a full scale international slave trading industry to provide them with a dependable supply of black slaves. The primary purpose of forced black labor was to bring whites' newly acquired land to and value productivity and value by clearing the forests, building the houses, raising the crops, tending the livestock, preparing the food, and raising and comforting the white families. Second, the slaves were to supply England's industry with valuable cash crops and commodities. After the 1660s, all of the colonies had written black enslavement into their statutes. England, as the mother country and the overseer of the colonies, was the first to codify the colony's public policy on black slavery into an act passed in 1667 called the Act to Regulate the Negroes on British Plantations. The Act to Regulate the Negroes on British Plantations. Besides regulating the slave trading industry, this act introduced the concept of blacks as personal property and advocated strict and severe treatment of slaves. A doctrine of black expendability and explicitly advocating in this act. The doctrine of black expendability was explicitly advocated in this act, which granted white society the right to brand, whip, or actually kill enslaved blacks. 4 years later, in 1671, another Maryland Act strengthened the public policy by enacting the doctrine of non interference. This doctrine notified religious organizations that religious conversations and baptism of slaves before or after importation to North America did not entitle the slaves to freedom as some slaves had hoped. hoped. This non interference doctrine was later expanded under the concept of personal property rights, which soothed the fears of slave owners who were concerned about losing their investment in any slaves who converted to Christianity. Uh, The colonies devoted the next 20 years to perfecting a public policy that defined with mathematical precision what individuals, races, or ethnic groups would be slaves and how they were to be treated. By 1705, Virginia produced a codification of laws applying to slaves called the Slave Codes, which standardized the public policy on blacks as well as white behavior towards blacks. The codes imbued the public policy on blacks with a new kind of social arrangement of accountability within the white community. Within a white community, it not only established rules of conduct with specified penalties for slaves, but it also implied a code of conduct for all white persons in their relations with blacks. It prohibited any white person from committing any act that elevated the status of blacks or demonstrated leniency in the treatment of slaves. The slave codes premised were premised in the belief that humility and weakness in the treatment of slaves anywhere was a threat to slavery and white privileged lifestyle everywhere. The slave codes were premised in the belief that humility and weakness in the treatment of slaves anywhere was a threat to slavery and white privilege lifestyle everywhere. Okay. All right. We'll be back. We'll be back in a few.